Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to Cinelit. Today we are looking forwards and backwards by turning our eye to the character Erwin M. Fletcher, aka Fletch. First introduced by novelist Gregory MacDonald in his novel in 1974, the book series will go on to encompass 9 official Fletch books, 11 if you count the 2 Son of Fletch books, between the years 1974 and 1994. In 1985, Chevy Chase stepped into the sneakers of the Los Angeles journalist for the first of 2 cinematic outings in Fletch and Fletch Lives in 1989. And now for the looking forward part. Filming has begun on a new adaptation of the second Fletch book, Confess Fletch, starring John Hamm as Erwin Morris Fletcher. My name is Adam Marsh, and I am joined by Cinelit's resident expert, Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
I'm good, thanks, Adam. Yeah, thinking back to a podcast we did some time ago on 80s American comedies, and we talked then a lot about the John Belushis and Dan Aykroyds and John Candys. So it'll be a nice chance to talk about one of their contemporaries here.
Absolutely, and continuing that line of thoughts of 80s comedies podcast that we recorded, we have invited director and producer and 80s film enthusiast Dominic Burns. How are you, Dom?
I'm great. I'm stoked to get to be on the podcast again. I'm an official fan, so the fact I get to come on and chat with you boys is great. It's great fun.
Cool. So we're talking Fletch. I'm assuming you've seen these movies, Dom, being an 80s film fan. I'd be very upset if you hadn't.
Seen them many times. In fact, watched them both very recently, so didn't need to rewatch them for this podcast.
Daryl, are you a fan of the films?
So. I saw them when they came out, and they weren't quite my cup of tea. Chevy Chase, I've always had a little bit of a problem with. He's not been my favourite of that gang of Saturday Night Live era comics. And but I watched the films again more recently, and I think as we've had stuff like Inherent Vice and The Big Lebowski in the intervening years, I can sort of see where these films now fit into what you might call modern American crime cinema or modern American detective cinema. And I suppose it goes back a little bit to Elliot Gould in The Long Goodbye, who we talked about in the Robert Altman podcast. So yeah, Fletch is growing on me.
I think Fletch is definitely in with that sort of like Beverly Hills Cop gang of style of a relatively serious movie with a comedian in the lead role. I mean, Fletch is probably more comedy leaning than Beverly Hills Cop is, but particularly with the special effects and the makeup effects that Chevy Chase does in those movies, it does lean towards more comedy, which is a slight departure from the original books. But Fletch was a big success. I mean, it balanced out a really nice mix between the Saturday Night Live Chevy Chase and the movie star Chevy Chase, and managed to bring the two together.
Made him a big star in Britain.
Well, that's it. Yeah, but I argue it's most of his most coherent movie at that point, where he actually managed to bottle something of his charisma and something of his cinema character, I guess, that Chevy Chase has in a big way.
Certainly made him a big star over here in the UK, I think, because as we've said on previous podcasts, Saturday Night Live wasn't a thing over here. You know, it's huge in the States, but this was in the days when we had 3 TV channels and there were imported American programs, but nothing like Saturday Night Live was coming over. And the big talk shows weren't coming over here. You know, we didn't sort of know who Johnny Carson and David Letterman and people like that were. So American comedy at that sort of level was sort of almost unknown in Britain up to the 80s and maybe beyond. We were discovering people like Dan Aykroyd, John Candy, Belushi through the movies that came over here. And Chevy Chase often did sort of supporting roles and was a sort of face that was known to British audiences. This was his big breakthrough here. This was where he became a European star as well as an American star.
Yeah, because Chase had, I mean, I would argue that his character in Foul Play is similar. It's almost like the blueprint of the character he plays in Fletch. But of course, that film didn't land in the same way. And I think it is actually quite interesting because Adam, coincidentally, a few weeks ago, we were having this conversation in that the first Fletch film is actually quite a serious film in many ways. And it's an incredibly interesting proposition that it sets out at the beginning of the film. You know, Fletch is hired by somebody to kill them. I mean, that's very interesting.
What a one-line plot.
Yeah. And of course, the beach setting, the drugs on the beach and everything. And so, in much in the way that Beverly Hills Cop was originally going to be a Sylvester Stallone vehicle, you could absolutely have seen Fletch being played by somebody straight down the line with it. Admittedly, the disguise stuff, that's the only real kind of discrepancy there. But maybe they'd have leaned away from that were it not for such a comedic actor. But other than that, in terms of the plot of Fletch, it could have been played much more straight. I mean, for me, I think it's so much more fun to have those comedy elements in it. And I think actually, as much as I genuinely enjoy the sequel, that tonal difference, whereas the sequel kind of led too far into the comedy and didn't have anything like as good a plot as the first one. That was the big difference between the two films. So yeah, I think it definitely seems to me as that first Chevy Chase. The Chevy Chase vehicle that really got him going away from the small screen, because even to this day, I would argue that Saturday Night Live is nothing compared to over here. I mean, we're aware of it over here, but we're nowhere near aware of it. The only reason we know so many of the Saturday Night alumni is because they are usually in massive hit comedies, which is how we know them over here.
Yeah. Now you talked about the casting of Chase there, Dom, and how that possibly may have sort of affected or altered the tone of what this movie was going to be. Because I know that they were talking to Jeff Bridges about this, who might well have been a sort of Elliot Gould in Long Goodbye sort of character, and we saw elements of that in Big Lebowski later on. But Adam, you were mentioning to me that one or two other names were connected with the part.
Yeah, I mean, the producer of this was Peter Douglas, Kirk Douglas's son, Michael Douglas's brother, and he'd had a few hits in the early 80s, the Final Countdown, and a couple of others. And he read the book in 1974 and immediately wanted to make it. And was just trying to go, and it took him about 10 years. And he kind of like followed the rights. You know, the rights would get sold occasionally, and then he'd go and find the next guy and go, hey, do you want to make a Fletch film? You own the rights now. I'm up for doing that. And it just couldn't work. And at one point, it got sold to a British record company, and they wanted Mick Jagger in the role, or David Bowie. God. And he was just like, oh, I'm not sure about that. And they were like, no, you're right. Actually, you're right. It's ridiculous. But, so they were briefly mentioned as potential Irwin M. Fletchers.
Did they ever offer it to Michael Keaton, do you know?
No, they didn't. No. I think a lot of the names were mentioned. I think Chevy Chase.
Michael Douglas, apologies. His brother, the obvious.
No, Michael Douglas liked it and because he read it and he liked it. But he was like, it's not for me, but it's a goer. He kept getting turned down by different studios. And Michael Douglas kept saying, to Peter Brooks as well. But there's a hit here. There is a hit here in this film.
I'm not sure it's not for Michael Douglas. I can see him as this at that time.
Yeah.
I can see him as this character.
Yeah,
Well, I think that, but I think he thought it wasn't for him. I think more than anything.
Yeah.
But I think the only person they actually offered it out to was Chevy Chase. But I think it went through the mill of like tentatively sounding out other people if they'd be interested, kind of thing. But once Chevy came on board, I think also the author had final say on casting when he sold the rights.
Really?
So he could kibosh anybody that he didn't think was right for the role. And
that's interesting because I've not actually. You're the expert on the books, Adam. I've never read the books. I'm embarrassed to say, but you were saying that actually Chevy Chase is actually quite different to the Fletch character in the books. It's very interesting that the author gave his okay. No.
But yeah, I guess potentially. I mean, I think maybe he had final rights, but ultimately he wasn't the kind of author who was like, he must be played by this person. It was just a case of like, oh yeah, no, he kind of fits. He'd work, kind of thing. I think
it wasn't different like the Tom Cruise Jack Reacher difference.
Oh no! It wasn't anything like that. It was more a case of like, I think the dry humor is in there, which I think is probably what made him think Chevy Chase would be a good fit. The dry, sardonic humor is in the books. The book character is very much more amoral, much more ethically loose, I guess.
Can you give us an example?
Well, he hates his ex-wives to a borderline misogynistic manner. I think he's been hounded by his ex-wives all the time, which you kind of get a little bit of that in the movie with his ex-wife chasing him up for alimony and his lawyer and all that kind of thing. You get that in the movie, but it's much more played for laughs, and it's much more like I'll sort it. He's just dodging payment. He's not being malicious. Whereas in the books, it's much more of a case of like, she left him because he was horrible to her, and now he won't pay alimony. It's more those kind of things.
So is the script of the first movie sort of close to the plot of one of the novels? Because as Dom said, it's absolutely ingenious. This sort of central core idea.
The central premise is exactly the same of the book, about Fletch being approached on the beach and being asked to kill someone. That's the basic premise. The fact that it's the first 100 words or so are all dialogue. I mean, all these Fletch books are quite dialogue heavy. And they're written with a really sharp eye on dialogue. So
it's like sort of film noir voiceover style then, in print.
Not so much No. There's a lot of actual dialogue, not first person.
Actual conversation.
Yeah, it's very conversational dialogue. Yeah. In that respect, the first 100 words or so of the book. So it's basically just a series of dialogue. It's what's your name, Fletch. What's your full name, Fletcher. What's your first name? Irwin. What? Irwin M. Fletcher. People call me Fletch. And then straight away, Irwin Fletcher, I have a proposition to make you. I will give you $1,000 just listening to it. If you decide to reject the proposition, you take the $1,000, go away, and never tell anyone we talked. Fair enough. Is it criminal? I mean, what do you want me to do? Of course. Fair enough. For $1,000, $1,000 I can listen. What do you want me to do? I want you to murder me.
That's absolutely brilliant.
It's just like boom,
absolutely
boom.
brilliant. Yeah, what a start.
Who doesn't want to know what happens next?
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's such a great hook for a book and subsequently for a movie. End of that first act turning point sort of thing. Boom, boom, boom. I want you to murder me. It's and it's all dialogue. No bits in between where it describes what's happening. Dialogue, and the books are very similar to that, particularly the early ones.
That sounds really sort of daring and very, very sort of punchy as well.
Yeah, I think they were fairly similar to the Spencer novels, the crime novels. I think there's been this one. Netflix has just made a movie with Mark Wahlberg in the character.
Did Jason Statham do that character at one point?
No, Jason Statham did the Parker.
Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Mark Wahlberg did the Spencer thing recently.
Yeah, I saw it. Actually. Yeah.
Well, that was a long-running book of detective crime novel type things, high on dialogue, low on description. But yeah, but the Fletch books were immediately popular in 74. There'd been 6 books before the film came out. So it was fairly well established as a character already going in. So I think maybe there was some backlash when the film came out that it wasn't quite as amoral and gritty as, gritty with a small G, but, as it is in the book.
Because I suppose you cast Chevy Chase and you get really the sort of character that I wasn't into as a viewer at that time, which is why it's taken me a while to sort of warm to the films. He's this sort of super confident, sort of slick, fast talking, snappy retorts to everything, bang, bang, bang like that. And perfect for Chevy, but not my kind of character really, or wasn't my kind of character. I have sort of grown to like those sort of figures more over the years.
Softened, Daryl. You've softened.
Yeah, I think so. or I've become more responsive, I think, to that type of American comedy. And yeah, as I say, it's been interesting to see the influence of this type of character on films that have come along since, like Inherent Vice and so on, and this sort of bum detective idea. I mean, it's so great that he seems to sort of, his life seems to sort of revolve around the beach in this first movie, and I think the whole beach community is fantastic. It's my favourite sort of element of the film is the guys that he meets there. There's George Wendt from Cheers playing the sort of guy in the shack. You've got these guys who seem to be the sort of cleanest bunch of the most likable bunch of heroin addicts you'll ever see. But it sort of plays quite nicely. It's completely unrealistic, but it plays nicely. They're good characters, and they have a good relationship with Chevy's character, I think. I really do like that. They're my favourite scenes.
There was some backlash by the studios over the drugs angle to it, because there was a lot of drugs storylines in the mid-'80s. It's like Hollywood was being flooded by cocaine at that time. So, it's not surprising there was a lot of drug smuggling dramas knocking around. And they felt like this one, making light of it, was not as impactful.
That was the point I was thinking in terms of the light tone. I find it quite interesting, and again, to make that comparison between this and Beverly Hills Cop, which isn't an obvious comparison, but I think it works in the sense that I would argue that Beverly Hills Cop could have been a very forgettable movie were it not for Eddie Murphy. If you think about the actual content of Beverly Hills Cop, it is very ABC. It's very sort of standard stuff. And it's very much Eddie Murphy that lifts that into something magical. And don't get me wrong, there's some cracking supporting performers as well. The great villain and obviously Judge Reinhold, etc. But with Fletch, you've actually got a really fascinating, intricate plot, and it could have worked in all sorts of different. They could have applied a different tone to it, completely different tone to it. It could have been deadly serious. It could have even gone down something as serious as Panic in Needle Park, if you think about it. It actually could have gone down that way, and so I can understand it makes sense that the studio would have felt a little uncomfortable at the lightness of touch that quite a gritty subject was given. But they obviously, I think they pulled it off magnificently. But you can understand the studio being a little unnerved by it.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think that's one of the problems. It went through quite a lot of script changes. So you had the original screenwriter who came on board, wrote his version of the film, which was slightly different to the novel, and particularly with regards to the dialogue, because the books are quite dialogue heavy, as we've said. He rewrote them because he felt like, well, it's his dialogue, it's his tone, it's his. But I need to write it for what I'm going to write. It's my dialogue for the scene. So he lifted some of it over, what mainly was his own dialogue, still keeping the same witty, sardonic repartee that he's known for. And then he left and went and did directing another job. And they brought in another screenwriter who did some stuff. And then the other guy got fired off his project whilst they were shooting Fletch, and he came back on Fletch and he said he's described it, says it's like dial a joke. I'm in New York, they're shooting in LA, and occasionally I get a phone call saying, "We need a scene set in an airport for Chevy. Can you write something?" And then he writes something and fax it over, and then it's in the movie. It's like just like I've seen this great airport hangar. Like, so that whole scene in the airport hangar where he's got the fake teeth and doing the whole thing. That was literally written 2 or 3 days before he shot it. So,
do you know what the other project was the writer was on that he got fired off?
I do. It was Andrew Bergman, who was the screenwriter, who's also directed other stuff as well. He directed
Undercover Blues,
The Freshman, Marlon Brando.
I love
did a couple of Nicolas Cage movies.
Honeymoon in Vegas, yeah.
And it could happen to you as well with Cage, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because he directed Striptease as well. He just said that, that's very similar. It's in the same vein and same world as Fletch inhabits. There's sort of like Kyle Hyacinth.
I mean, this is one of those films that's made in the mid '80s, and you watching it today looks like it. It's really representative of its time and its era, I think. I mean, obviously, to add to that, we've got Harold Faltermeyer providing the score as well for this and next time. So, and again, the just got those 80s synths all over it. So,
the soundtrack's great. The soundtrack is great. Really elevates it.
And of course connects it with stuff like Beverly Hills Cop there in a big way. So no,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's so I can hear that soundtrack. Oh, I love it.
You sort of get the sense with Harold Faltermeyer that he knew that he was in a sort of bubble, that he, people were coming to him saying, we want you for our movie, and there is this sense that comes through in the music that, right, this is my moment. People are probably not going to be asking me to do this in 15, 20 years' time. This is what I can do, and I'm going to sort of whack the hell out of this now for the next 2 or 3 years. And he really made his reputation, I think, across a few films in a short space of time.
I hope they nod to the soundtrack in the new one. I really do. I hope they've got to, haven't they? They've got to at least nod to it.
You've got to, yeah.
It'd be interesting to see how they do that with the new film. We'll talk about that later, but just for completeness, but the movie that Andrew Bergman was fired off was a movie called Big Trouble. It was replaced by John Cassavetes directing. He had Peter Falk and Alan Arkin in it, so he was fired off that and came back to Fletch and became a dial a joke kind of guy on the rest of that movie. Yeah, so Fletch. Let's go back to what we're talking about. Fletch ingredients are all there. It kind of, for me, it's that perfect balance between the Chevy Chase and the music and the seriousness of the plot. And then when you move it on to, it's a very fine balance. It's a very fine collection of ingredients that you need to have to create that type of movie. And then when we get to Fletch Lives 5 years later, the balance is off for me. The ingredients are not quite there. They're not quite.
Well, I think it's more of a throwaway. I really enjoy the Fletch Lives because I enjoy, I'm a complete sucker, as we know. Anyone who listens to this podcast knows that I'm just a sucker for anything sort of throwaway 80s like that. But I think that for me is the term. The second one is throwaway. The first one isn't, and it has genuine depth and it has a content, and even down to little things like the ethics of journalism. There's so much to the first one. And whereas the second one, it's fun and it's a good laugh and it's kind of like a bit of chewing gum for the eyes, a bit of escapism, but it doesn't have anything like the depth. And it does feel...
It does
try. Yeah, it does. It's not a bad film, I don't think. I just don't think it's anywhere near as good as the first.
No, I mean, it tries. But I think one of the big problems with the second film is that the seriousness of the plot, it could have been a really serious plot. The sort of like, the church and the nuclear fallout, the dumping of toxic waste. That's it's Aaron Brockovich, isn't it? It's that kind of, you could have done something along those lines with it. But for me, the balance with Chevy Chase he plays quite a few characters in this. Where he gets dressed up as Ed Harley of the Harley Davidson, and then he gets dressed up to go on the preacher show. There's quite a few characters that he's doing in this, which makes it stand out. And
maybe
I think
a little
also,
too many.
A little too many. And also the problem with the balance on that is that the ministry, the Bible land, the reverend guy who's on TV, that's almost like a character anyway. It's such a pronounced type, praise the Lord, it's very over the top in that respect anyway. And also you set it in the deep south sort of thing as well, and the lawyer character is like out of a stereotype as well, so you've got all these characters who suddenly it feels like it's a movie populated by characters rather than real people. And when you've got Chevy doing characters on top of that,
Chevy's sort of playing half of the characters.
Exactly, yeah. It's just too much. It's too much.
I'm nodding along with everything you're saying. Yeah. I think that's a really shrewd observation, actually, and I think that you've kind of you've found, because it does have a sort of plot that could go either way, and it does have certain on the surface it does have a lot of the elements to make it as good as the first. And I also think that I think at that point, and I again to make another comparison to Beverly Hills Cop 2, I love Beverly Hills Cop 2. I'm a big fan, but it does feel like Eddie Murphy's completely let off the leash for that movie, and and in some ways you feel like it'd be improved if he'd just drawn back ever so slightly. And I would apply the exact same thing to Fletch Lives, in that I think it would have benefited us. Chevy was such a huge star at that point, people would have been forgiven for thinking that this is just a great stage upon which for him to prance. But actually, if he'd have just been drawn back ever so slightly, I feel like the film would have benefited from that, as opposed to just letting him just go off.
Yeah, I think that was sort of actor power by the 80s was so strong that people could do that. You'd get into a sequel or a franchise even, and you'd sort of be calling the shots in a big way. I mean, both of these films are directed by Michael Ritchie, who'd made some great stuff in the 70s. And I think the difference between the two films, or one of the differences between them, is that they're both directed by Michael Ritchie, but Fletch looks and feels like a Michael Ritchie movie, and Fletch Lives feels a bit more like a sort of job for hire. Anybody could have directed it. Anyone capable of sort of handling an actor that's playing these sort of multiple roles or these multiple personas. I think one of the big strengths of the first movie as well, and again, people that have listened to the CineLit podcast over the months and years have heard us mention a lot of these names already, is in the really, really strong supporting cast. I mean, who've we got here? Richard Libertini, who we love from All of Me, Emmett Walsh from All of Me and Blood Simple, we love. Ina Davis in there, Joe Don Baker, Kenneth Mars, George Wendt, who I've mentioned, even Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in there, who's great. And I think it's got this really strong sort of knot of supporting characters. But I think that's good for Chevy, who again was a sort of confident comic performer. But I think there's a difference between turning up every week on Saturday Night Live with your mates and being the lead in a big Hollywood movie. And I think the pressure was on here, and to be surrounded, if you've got that sort of pressure on you, to be surrounded by sort of wonderful actors as these, does half the job, really. They take a lot of the slack.
I kind of feel for him, though, for Fletch Lives. Because, before Fletch, he'd done National Lampoon's Vacation.
Yeah.
So he'd already done that role. He'd done Caddyshack. This was more in line with Caddyshack, to be honest. His character in Caddyshack was much more aligned to Fletch. But after he did Fletch, he didn't really do a character like Fletch for the rest of the 80s until Fletch Lives. He was in like Three Amigos, straight comedy. Spies Like Us, straight comedy.
Yeah. Did John Carpenter's Invisible Man movie?
That was after Fletch Lives, but like Caddyshack 2, he did all these movies where they were straight comedies, really. And I can see them coming into Fletch Lives saying, well, this is a vehicle for Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase is a comedy actor. We're making a comedy. And I think the Fletch brand, if you want to talk about it as we would now, deserved more detail in actually what made Fletch good. It wasn't the comedy, necessarily just the comedy that Chevy Chase brought to it. It was the seriousness of the plot. It was the balance between the intrinsics of the plot that really sort of like lifted that movie.
By the time the first Fletch rolled around, they were making a Fletch movie. That was a Fletch movie that starred Chevy Chase. But by the time Fletch Live came around, that's a Chevy Chase movie where he was playing Fletch. I mean, and that difference is, you know, perfectly exemplified within the difference of the two films. And I think that the run of hits and a couple of misses, but generally hits that Chase had in the 80s, the audience kind of expects, you know, they want that comedy, they want this, you know, and as we know, it's incredibly difficult for a comedic actor. I mean, take Adam Sandler, for example. I mean, he's made, I mean, obviously, he's just landed with Uncut Gems, but if you look at Punch Drunk Love, cracking film, but nobody, you know, just didn't get that audience. It's so difficult for a comedic actor to make that transition to a more serious role. So you can see them, you can see why, you know, it's quite clear why they were hesitant to make it too serious, even to go as serious as the first one was. And the first one was hardly what you would describe as a serious movie, as we've already discussed. So you can see why, you know, it was almost a bit of a, you know, runaway train, wasn't it? It was always going to collide with a wall at some point.
Yeah, no, I think ultimately you needed Ritchie to be a bit more stern on it. I guess more. I think again.
Did he have the power to do that at that point?
Possibly not.
I don't know. I'm not saying he did.
No. I wouldn't have thought so, no. But you needed that sort of like balance.
Maybe a John Landis to come in, someone who did have the power.
I think the thing was you'd got a director who was sort of on the slide and a star who was really on the rise, and then they sort of met in the middle, you know. And Ritchie. I think the Michael Ritchie of 1985 was already sort of on the skids a little bit, and luckily had a hit with Fletch. And by 89, I think he was pretty much a spent force, you know, and so other people were possibly, including Chevy most likely, were possibly calling the shots, and we got the movie that we got as a result of that. You know, I mean, Fletch Lives is good and entertaining, but yeah, you can sense there are problems under the surface.
Is Fletch Lives based on one of the books, Adam?
That's another thing. No, it isn't. It's an original story written for the screen, so it wasn't based on any of the novels.
Do you know why that was? Why did they go down that?
Don't know, because they would have had the rights to the books. I mean, they'd have licensed the books. I think they just felt like we need to tailor a script for Chevy Chase rather than adapt something that's already been written.
That all that said, I do love that they don't just do the standard 80s sequel thing and remake the first movie. You know, it's a very different. It's a pointedly different film, and I do admire that in it. You know, the complete change of setting. You know, slightly broader sort of comic tone to it, but I think one that doesn't harm the movie and doesn't harm the entertainment value. Chevy doing even more of his sort of shtick and his impersonations and taking on ludicrous pseudonyms and that sort of thing. But it's a different movie. And I do sort of admire it in a way for that, because there were so many films where part two was just a retread of part one. And
really fair point. Yeah, really fair point.
The books kind of follow that similar thing as well. I mean, the books, in the first maybe couple of books, he's a journalist. But then he hops around. It is this one set in Brazil entirely. It's like this mystery in Brazil where he's on holiday. There's one where he's a press officer on the campaign trail, and murder happens there. There's one set in Kenya, you know, when he's in his early years. You know, it's like, so the books do bounce around. I don't know whether that's Gregory MacDonald being not interested in making the same type of story over and over again.
Do you know if the new one is based on one of the books, Adam?
The new one's based on the second book, Confess Fletch. So it's arguably the first two books are the best books in that series. So it's based on one of the two that were held up as being the best books.
Did they continue to come out after the films, or were they all written before the films?
No, they were. The six were written before the films came out, and then he wrote another 3 Fletch books. And then in the early 90s, he did 2 Son of Fletch books. So they were written afterwards. I mean, the books that I've got on my shelf, the paperbacks, have got Chevy Chase's face painted covers with Chevy Chase painted on them. So, you know.
I was saying to you earlier, when you read the books, do you sort of see Chevy as the character on the page? You know, I suppose it's difficult not to.
Well, I mean, yeah, I was born in '76, so I wasn't reading these books as they came out. So for me, my first experience of Fletch was the films, and I only got into the books because I was in New York and I managed to go into the secondhand bookshop, and they had about 7 of them all there on the shelf, like £1 each. I'm like, all right, it was like,
Yeah.
It would have been worse if I hadn't have bought them. Yeah. So I suddenly found myself in a position where I could read a fair chunk of the Fletch series, and I've picked up the rest elsewhere since then.
What are the Son of Fletch books like? Are they?
I haven't read those yet. That's where I'm up to with them. I've read all the Fletch books, and see, I think he did. They bounce around in time as well. The Fletch books, so they're not concurrent, following on. So some of them are set before the first Fletch book. So the last 2 that he published in the '80s were prequels of the early days of Fletch, which was the Fletch 1 was the book that Kevin Smith was looking to adapt when he was involved in the Fletch rights series.
I can't remember, because I can't believe I've never asked Kevin about this, but for some inexplicable reason I haven't. When Kevin was looking at doing it, was he looking at doing it with Zach Braff, or was he?
No, he. Well, I think later on he was, but I think initially he was looking to do it with Chevy Chase and do Fletch 3, and it became difficult, I think, to work it out, whether it was a deal making or whatever. It became difficult, so they decided to do Fletch 1 as a prequel with Jason Lee playing the lead.
Yes, that was it. I do remember.
And then I think Zach Braff came on board later on when another producer got the rights, who was the producer who did Scrubs. So the Scrubs producer got hold of it, and he was talking about him. And Jason Sudeikis has been mooted for taking on the role, and suddenly out of the blue, they announced that John Hamm's not doing it. Yeah. He's filming it. Yeah, it was like there's no word, and suddenly it's like we're on set. It's like blooming heck, you know.
I know. It came out. I hadn't heard anything about it. I mean, I knew that Kevin was keen on it, and this isn't in any way first-hand info. This is just what I've read and heard, that him and Chevy didn't see eye to eye. Yeah, that was the last I'd heard about it from Kev's point of view, although I'd have loved to have seen him do it. I think he would have smashed it. But it was so good to hear that they were on set filming. I mean, it's just finally that, because they do feel like, they do feel like great movies prime for a remake. You know, I mean, I would argue you could have taken the plot. The plot's so good for that first film. They could have used that and redone it, but I guess so many people have seen it. But still,
it's a tricky one because it's so unique. It's memorable. Therefore, you haven't had time to forget it. You know, so when you remake it, you know, it's what's the point? You know.
Yeah, and like Dom said, it's a story that you could perhaps approach, even if you did the same story, you could perhaps approach it in different ways. But I think audiences might react against that. They go into the film expecting a comedy now, and if you delivered anything that was sort of divergent from that, they wouldn't like it, and it'd be a potential flop. So yeah, the only way I think is to do a complete retread of the first, and what's the point of that? You know,
I wonder how daft they'll go then. I wonder, tonally, it'll be really interesting to see where this goes, because I mean, as you know, nobody, as far as I know, knows anything about what they're doing with it. I think John Hamm is cracking casting. I love the casting.
He's not known for being the comedy like Chevy Chase is, though, is it?
But he's got a dry,
absolutely.
Sort of, you know.
I think for that angle, he's definitely great. It's just like you do wonder whether they'll like, okay, well, this is a comedy, but it's one of those dry, wisecracking.
Yeah, comedies. I think so. I think they'll probably go less broad with it, and a little bit more towards the sort of wry sort of. Yeah, rather than the big playing.
Exactly what you mean. Yeah. Which is what, and I hope they do that.
I can hear the director say, "Put down the makeup, put down the prosthetics,
the fake nose, and the
we don't need fake teeth."
Yeah, I mean, you know, on Fletch Lives, you know, there's I love the sequence, the whole zippity doo big sort of Disney song and dance number. It's great, but You want to watch that for 5 minutes on YouTube. You don't want it in Fletch Lives.
I think the problem with it, they had the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar dream sequence earlier on in the first film, but it was much more about like it wasn't overtly spoof, which the dream sequence in the second one was very much comedy spoof, and it was just like I don't know, it just didn't feel like they got it right for me in that second one.
Yeah,
I thought it was funny for what it was.
But it was, but the style of comedy was not like it was like. But isn't it supposed to reflect what is going on in his brain? It's like it wasn't. It was just him having a pop at all these people and gazing at a girl's boobs.
Yeah, but the first one did have. I mean, the first one, again, to talk about that balance, they just nailed it. You know, like you've got a perfect example of Chase's comic timing in the Moon River gag, which still just drops me off my seat. It's so funny. But then you do have like when he takes on the more when in the more serious moments he's completely believable, and that's actually more difficult to pull off than might seem the case on the surface. It's very difficult to get that right, and I think he nails it. I think, but as we're just I'm retreading trodden ground here on the podcast in terms of we've established the difference between the first and the second movie, and I would imagine that the new movie would retread the first and the second, more Fletch than Fletch Lives, which it seemed from what you're saying, Adam, that Fletch was a lot closer to the books than Fletch Lives was.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there was certain characters that were in the book that are not in the film. I mean, Gregory MacDonald talks about the first book, and the character of Bobby in that book was his sole reason for writing the book, and that character is not in the film. So yeah, it did take a character called Bobby in the book.
And who was he?
I think it was a female character. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I just remember reading that quote where, whilst he was happy that the film was a success and it was a funny movie, he didn't feel like it was a direct adaptation of his book in that way. In some ways,
is he still alive, the author?
No, he's died, but he wrote other stuff as well. He wrote a film called Running Scared.
Yeah, I know the film with Paul Walker.
No. Running Scared, 1972. Robert Powell. David Hemmings directed it. He co-wrote it.
No, I've not seen that. No.
So he that was based on one of his books. He also wrote a film. I don't know if it's based on one of his books or whether it's based on a screenplay that he wrote. The Brave. And it's based on a book. The Brave, Johnny Depp's directorial debut.
Yeah.
He wrote the book of that. He apparently turned up on set with Johnny Depp, and Johnny said, "Have you read the script?" He said, "No." He said, "Good. You can fight me afterwards." It's just like, great. Okay, this is going to turn out well, isn't it? So he's not. I don't think he's had the best of luck with some of his stuff that's been adapted. But Fletch was a big hit, so that was fine.
I think you just got to accept, haven't you, that once you sell the rights to if you sell the rights to your book, then it's just going to go whatever way it goes. You just got to kind of make your peace with it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, the legacy's there, and we're going to get the new movie hopefully next year. Which hopefully should draw more attention to the books as well. Maybe a reprint series. Who knows?
I'm sure it would. I mean, I would argue that without the movies, that people wouldn't be having the conversations about. I'm sure they were great books, but without the movies, that doubtful to me that people would still be talking about them with the frequency they are doing now.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Cool, lovely. Thank you very much, guys. That was our little take on Fletch and Fletch Lives and the Fletch character. Please do check out our Facebook page. We will be back again in a couple of weeks' time. Take care.